In the early hours of Sunday morning, a major escalation erupted in the Middle East as Iran launched a large-scale missile and drone attack against Israel, marking a turning point in the region's already fragile security landscape. It was not just another exchange of fire. It was a deliberate, coordinated operation involving dozens of ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and unmanned aerial vehicles, many of which were designed to overwhelm Israel's air defense systems. The strike, unprecedented in scale, immediately triggered air raid sirens across major Israeli cities, sending civilians scrambling for shelter, while the military scrambled its Iron Dome and other defense systems in rapid response. From intelligence reports and official statements, it became clear that Iran had spent considerable time preparing for this offensive. The missiles were launched from multiple locations deep within Iranian territory, indicating that this wasn't a rogue operation or a knee-jerk retaliation, but rather a calculated decision, likely involving the highest levels of Iranian command. The trajectory of the attack also demonstrated a keen understanding of Israeli defense capabilities. Many of the incoming threats were directed not just at military sites, but also at civilian infrastructure, raising the stakes significantly and drawing the attention of the entire international community. The immediate question that followed was, why now? What triggered this massive offensive? While the underlying tensions between the two nations are nothing new, this specific attack came just days after a suspected Israeli airstrike in Damascus reportedly killed high-ranking members of Iran's Revolutionary Guard. Iran's leadership, in their public statements, framed the missile barrage as a justified response. A message, they said, to Israel and its allies. But this attack was more than just retribution. Its scale and scope suggest a deliberate attempt to shift the status quo, to show that Iran is not only willing to escalate, but also capable of striking Israel directly with significant firepower. As missiles streaked across the skies and explosions lit up the night in parts of Israel, the human cost quickly began to emerge. Emergency services responded to multiple impact sites, with reports of civilian injuries, damaged homes, and infrastructure disruption. Thankfully, Israel's multi-layered missile defense system, particularly the Iron Dome, David's Sling, and Arrow systems, intercepted a majority of the incoming threats, preventing what could have been a much larger catastrophe. But the fact that dozens of missiles were able to penetrate those layers, causing actual damage on the ground, has raised concerns about the future effectiveness of even the most sophisticated defense networks when faced with saturation-style attacks. While much of the world was still waking up to the headlines, fighter jets and naval forces on both sides were put on high alert. Airports in Israel temporarily suspended operations. Air traffic was rerouted. Schools were closed and emergency protocols were activated in several cities. For many Israelis, the fear wasn't just about that single night, it was the dread that more could be coming. That this was just the opening volley in a broader conflict. And for Iranians, especially those in cities where the military had launched from, there was palpable tension as citizens braced for a possible counterstrike. The psychological impact on both nations' populations cannot be underestimated. In the midst of this chaos, it's crucial to remember the ordinary people who are affected the most. The families sleeping in their homes when the sirens wailed, the children being rushed into shelters in the dead of night, the elderly too frail to move quickly, the paramedics risking their lives to respond under threat of further attacks. These are the silent faces behind the headlines. As Aishai Henning-Yi continues to speak about this unfolding crisis, the focus must remain not just on military strategy or geopolitical calculations, but on the very real human consequences that such decisions bring. Beyond the immediate damage, the attack sent a strong signal. Iran crossed a line it had largely avoided in the past, openly, directly attacking Israeli territory from its own soil with a full-scale missile operation. It's a message not just to Israel, but to the wider world, especially those countries attempting to broker peace or maintain a neutral stance in the region. Whether this was a show of strength, a warning shot, or the beginning of a more dangerous chapter, one thing is certain: the fragile stability of the Middle East has been profoundly shaken. And now, with both nations locked in a state of heightened readiness, the next move is being watched not just in Tehran or Jerusalem, but in Washington, Moscow, Beijing, and Brussels. The world is holding its breath, not just in fear of what might come next, but in hope that reason somehow will prevail. To understand why Iran launched such a bold and dangerous attack on Israel, we need to look deeper than the surface event. This wasn't just a military maneuver. It was a statement forged from years of simmering hostility, strategic frustration, and political calculation. Iran has long accused Israel of conducting covert operations against its nuclear scientists, targeting its military assets in Syria, and trying to undermine its influence across the region. And from Iran's perspective, those accusations aren't just paranoia, they're part of a long-standing pattern. But this missile strike marks a significant shift. Iran didn't act through proxies this time. It acted directly, opening a new, more volatile chapter in a decades-long rivalry. For years, Iran has maintained a complex network of allied groups across the Middle East. Hezbollah in Lebanon, militias in Iraq, the Houthis in Yemen, and armed factions in Syria and Gaza. These groups have often been the ones to carry out confrontations with Israel, while Tehran stayed officially distant. That strategy allowed Iran to exert pressure and signal strength without triggering direct retaliation. But the latest events indicate a change in posture. Iran is no longer content to fight in the shadows. It chose to step forward openly and defiantly, and accept the consequences. That decision speaks volumes about what may be happening inside Iran's leadership. Perhaps a growing confidence in their military capabilities, or perhaps a belief that the usual rules of engagement no longer apply. The political climate inside Iran can't be ignored here. Internally, the regime faces enormous pressure. Economic struggles worsened by sanctions, growing public discontent, and cracks in national unity following months of unrest. Leaders in Tehran may have seen this strike as a way to reclaim control of the narrative, to shift the national focus outward toward a common enemy, and to remind Iranians of the strength and resolve of their military. Historically, governments under pressure have often turned to external confrontation as a way to consolidate domestic support. Iran's leaders may be betting that a bold display of strength can quiet dissent and inspire unity, at least temporarily. At the same time, this attack was deeply rooted in regional dynamics. The Middle East is a landscape of shifting alliances and constant recalibration. Iran sees itself as a central power in this landscape, one that must constantly defend its position from rivals both near and far. Israel's deepening ties with Arab states through the Abraham Accords, particularly with the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, have raised alarms in Tehran. To Iran, those developments are not just diplomatic, they're strategic threats. The closer Israel gets to Iran's neighbors, the more surrounded Iran feels. And from that perspective, the attack on Israel can also be seen as a warning not just to Israel, but to others who might think about aligning too closely with it. There's also the nuclear dimension. Iran's nuclear program has long been a source of tension, and recent years have seen it accelerate beyond previous limits. Israel has been vocal and consistent in its opposition to a nuclear-armed Iran, vowing to prevent it by any means necessary. Covert operations, sabotage, cyber attacks. These are all tools Israel has allegedly used to delay Iran's progress. But with the breakdown of nuclear talks and little diplomatic progress in sight, the temperature has continued to rise. Iran's missile strike could be interpreted as an assertion that it will not be deterred, that it can and will strike back directly if provoked. It was a way to reset the conversation, not at a negotiation table, but through firepower. Internationally, Iran may also be sending a message to the world powers watching from afar, to the United States, which continues to enforce sanctions and support Israel militarily, to European nations that have tried, often unsuccessfully, to keep diplomatic channels open, and even to Russia and China, both of which maintain complex but strategic ties with Tehran. Iran is showing that it's not simply a reactive player in global affairs. It's willing to seize the initiative, even at great risk. The timing of the attack, at a moment when global attention is fragmented and alliances are strained, was not accidental. Iran may believe that the current international environment gives it more room to maneuver without facing a unified global backlash. But whatever the reasoning, the consequences of this strategic choice are enormous. By acting so openly, Iran has raised the stakes not just for itself and Israel, but for the entire region. Other nations, both allies and rivals, are now calculating what this means for their own security. The era of shadow wars may be giving way to something much more dangerous, a direct confrontation between regional powers, with the rest of the world watching nervously from the sidelines. This was not just a strike on a country. It was a challenge to the entire balance of power in the Middle East. And that challenge will not go unanswered. The moment the first missile was launched, the world took notice. Iran's attack on Israel was not just a regional event, it was an international signal, and every major power, every neighboring country, began calculating its position, its next step, and its risks. In a region already burdened with historic grievances and fragile alliances, the ripple effect of this act was immediate and complex. Countries responded with statements, military posturing, and diplomatic outreach. But underneath all the official responses lies a deeper current: fear, uncertainty, and the urgent desire to avoid a slide into a much wider conflict. In the hours following the attack, Israel's allies quickly condemned Iran's actions. The United States, as expected, voiced strong support for Israel, reaffirming its ironclad commitment to Israeli security. American forces stationed in the region were placed on heightened alert, and defense systems near key bases were activated. US officials emphasized that while they were not seeking war, they would defend Israel against any further aggression. The message was clear: any escalation by Iran could draw a broader military response, and the United States would not sit on the sidelines. At the same time, American diplomats began urgent consultations with European allies and regional partners, trying to coordinate a unified stance. European leaders, too, expressed grave concern. Countries like France, Germany, and the United Kingdom issued strong condemnations of the missile strikes, calling them a dangerous escalation that could plunge the region into chaos. But behind the strong language was hesitation. Europe, already stretched by ongoing crises and internal challenges, is not eager to be pulled into another Middle Eastern conflict. There's also a sense of frustration. Many European leaders have spent years trying to mediate between Iran and the West, especially on the nuclear issue, and this attack felt like a collapse of those diplomatic efforts. They now face the delicate task of defending democratic values and regional stability without inflaming tensions further. On the other hand, reactions in the Middle East have been more fragmented. Some Gulf countries, like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, have found themselves walking a tightrope. While they quietly share Israel's concerns about Iran's growing influence, they also fear being drawn into direct conflict. Publicly, their statements have focused on the need for restraint and de-escalation, emphasizing that continued violence would destabilize the entire region. Privately, though, there's unease. These countries are aware that if conflict spreads, their economies, security, and civilian populations will all be at risk. Lebanon and Syria, long entangled in the broader Iran-Israel rivalry, have also found themselves on edge. In Lebanon, where Hezbollah maintains strong ties to Iran, many fear that Israel might preemptively strike Hezbollah positions in anticipation of a second front. Syrian territory has already been a battleground for indirect Iranian-Israeli conflict, and many analysts warn that continued hostilities could spill further into Syrian soil, worsening an already dire humanitarian crisis. The people in these countries, ordinary civilians already dealing with poverty, displacement, and instability, are bracing for yet another blow. Russia and China, two global players with strategic interests in the Middle East, responded in ways that reflected their own priorities. Russia, still deeply involved in Syria and seeking to maintain its influence across the region, called for calm and blamed Western interference for escalating tensions. China, ever focused on energy security and regional trade stability, urged both sides to exercise restraint. Neither nation explicitly took sides, but both clearly signaled that a broader war would disrupt their strategic calculations and economic interests. Their responses weren't just diplomatic. They were strategic efforts to maintain a balance in a region where both have quietly expanded their footprints. Meanwhile, global markets reacted with unease. Oil prices spiked amid fears of supply disruptions, as investors worried that a prolonged conflict could choke the Strait of Hormuz, through which a significant portion of the world's oil flows. Stock markets wavered, reflecting anxiety not just about war but about the global ripple effects, economic, political, and humanitarian, that would follow if violence intensifies. In every capital, from Washington to Riyadh to Beijing, leaders are weighing their next moves carefully, aware that any misstep could ignite something far more dangerous than what we've seen so far. But perhaps the most telling reactions came not from governments or financial institutions, but from people, citizens across the globe who watched the news with a growing sense of dread. In Tel Aviv and Tehran, in Beirut and Baghdad, in London and New York, people began to ask the same question: where does this go from here? The fear is not just about bombs and missiles. It's about the possibility that diplomacy will fail, that reason will be drowned out by rhetoric, and that yet another generation will grow up under the shadow of war. The world is watching, not just with eyes wide open, but with hearts clenched in hope that this chain of retaliation can somehow be broken. As the dust begins to settle after Iran's unprecedented missile strike on Israel, the world finds itself standing on the edge of something deeply uncertain. What happens next is not just a question of politics or military planning. It's a question of survival, of stability, and of whether the region can resist the pull toward a wider and potentially devastating war. The consequences of this attack are not confined to one night or one nation. They are already rippling outward, shaping the choices leaders will make in the coming days, weeks, and even years. And those choices will determine whether the Middle East sees a surge of diplomacy or descends into a prolonged and deadly conflict. The most immediate concern, of course, is the risk of escalation. Israel is unlikely to let such a bold strike go unanswered. Its doctrine has always been rooted in deterrence, responding with overwhelming force to any act of aggression. With Iranian missiles having penetrated Israeli airspace, damaging infrastructure and endangering civilian lives, public pressure is already mounting on Israeli leadership to strike back hard. Yet any retaliation runs the risk of sparking a full-blown war, one that would draw in not only both countries' militaries, but also their regional allies and proxy forces. A conflict of that scale wouldn't just be fought in Tehran and Tel Aviv. It would likely stretch into Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and beyond. And the broader the conflict becomes, the harder it will be to contain. One provocation can lead to another. One strike can trigger 10 more. It's a chain reaction, and once that reaction begins, stepping back becomes increasingly difficult. If Hezbollah in Lebanon opens a second front, if US forces in the region are targeted, or if Gulf nations are drawn in either militarily or politically, the entire Middle East could become engulfed in a confrontation with global implications. This is the stark reality that now looms, a reality that calls for restraint not out of weakness but out of wisdom. At the same time, both Iran and Israel now face critical questions about how they move forward internally. For Israel, there will be an urgent reassessment of national security. If even a sophisticated defense network like the Iron Dome can be overwhelmed by a sustained missile assault, what does that mean for the future of homeland defense? How do you protect a civilian population from this level of threat? And politically, how does a government respond to reassure its people without making irreversible decisions in the heat of anger? Iran, on the other hand, will be forced to consider whether the cost of this bold strike was worth it. Yes, the attack sent a message of strength, but at what price? If sanctions tighten further, if diplomatic isolation deepens, if its economy suffers even more, will the leadership in Tehran be able to maintain internal stability? And more importantly, will its people, who have already borne the brunt of economic hardship and social restrictions, be willing to continue shouldering the consequences of regional brinkmanship? There is also the danger of losing what little space is left for diplomacy. Before this attack, there were still fragile lines of communication, talks on Iran's nuclear program, informal channels through regional actors, and international efforts aimed at confidence building. Now, much of that has collapsed. Trust, already scarce, has been shattered. Rebuilding it will take time if it can be rebuilt at all. But this is where the international community must step in, not with threats or ultimatums, but with genuine engagement, creative diplomacy, and a willingness to listen to all sides. We must remember that peace, even when it seems out of reach, is not built overnight. It's built in moments of crisis like this, when leaders choose dialogue over destruction, when countries resist the easy path of revenge and choose the harder path of resolution. The world has seen enough war to know where this road leads. And in a region that has endured decades of bloodshed, another conflict would not be a beginning. It would be a continuation of pain, displacement, and loss that generations have already endured. Amid all this uncertainty, one truth remains: the people of the Middle East deserve better. Israelis and Iranians, like all people, want safety for their families, futures for their children, and freedom from fear. They do not want to be pawns in a geopolitical game. They want leaders who will fight not for war, but for stability, dignity, and peace. The road ahead is unclear and the stakes have never been higher. But the choice,